And right now we're joined by Victor Kipiani, chairman of GOK's think tank. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about that hope. And I just want to mention that bill again, that very controversial part. Any company, including media outlets and NGOs, would now be required to register as pursuing the interests of foreign power if receiving 20% of funds from abroad. Now, people went on the streets because they had hope. They thought they could change the government's decision, but that didn't work. So speaking of that hope, what's next for Georgia?
You did provide with very helpful coverage, and you pointed out that this second try was reintroducing the draft law as if renaming it and dropping out the reference to the agents still rings an ominous bell. It speaks about foreign influence. And when you speak about foreign influence, when you speak about being of service to foreign influence, you imply as if you're running against the national interests. And that reference to service to the foreign influence and to being an agent, in fact, it provides with a reminiscence of a bad legacy of Soviet times, when serving a foreign influence and running across the national or state interests could put anyone into danger. That's one point. So regardless of renaming the law, still it provides for the same substance, for the same messages, and for the same risks and threats. Another point that although technically this law is very simple and very straightforward, still, it runs contrary to the pro-European integration policies of Georgia. And we already have a number of robust statements by European politicians and by different institutions from Europe. And taking it into account that this nation is facing a next very critical decision by the European Union by fall of this year on opening accession talks with Georgia on EU membership. Of course, it poses very awkward questions for Georgian Dream and the ruling party. So, as you also mentioned, there is a range of interventions these days by European politicians and by US in particular. You also shown the certain footages of mass protests in Tbilisi and in other cities of Georgia. So there is still a space for hope, and it's also a limited also, but space for maneuver.
But we're looking
to react in a positive way.
But we're looking at the pictures right now of people marching, thousands of people marching outside of the parliament building. What about these people? Do you think they have hope? Because politically speaking, of course, there will be more meetings and we'll see what happens. But what about the Georgians right now?
I would take courage to say that this opposition to the bill and to this specific piece of legislation runs across the grassroots level of the Georgian society. So it's not just about the Georgian youth, but it's about various segments and various ingredients of Georgian society. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the tactics of the ruling party as if to wait out that support and to expect some fatigue in the protesters and within protesters. I think it's really a very baseless tactics and very baseless hope. So
speaking on that, Victor,
what we have to rely on, unfortunately, sadly and regretfully, relying on 2 points of pressures: the pressure from inside and the pressure from outside. That could eventually lead us to resolution of the crisis.
Victor, on that, you mentioned tactics as well, and I think that's going to be my next question. We're hearing reports, we have seen the footage through different outlets as well, a lot of beatings by the police, arrests by the police and security services. Can you give us any sort of number, what's happened so far? What is the state of some of these people? What's that on the ground look like?
it's really hard for me to speak about precise figures, but that is not as important, and I'll make my point even more clear. The most despicable side of those pictures, which we see, that the violence has been unleashed on practically unprecedented level. And therefore, the centerpiece of discussions these days is not just about the technicalities of the law, but about the state of the governance. And that takes us, to even more awkward questions. And the last but not the least, although it's really, again, hard for me to make any well-founded allegations, but it looks like on the surface and probably beneath that what's happening in Georgia around that piece of legislation and in terms of pro-European stance of Georgia, it's not just about domestic politics. It also provides for some geopolitical implications. Really, it's very hard to have a sense of the smoking gun in these realities. But I won't rule out that with the passage of time, we will have more evidences and more grounds to make those allegations even more convincing.
On geopolitical implications here, Victor, we have also word that I believe tomorrow we'll see Baltic foreign ministers as well as Iceland fly actually to Georgia to have high-level talks with the government. We're also hearing that the European Parliament, apparently on various levels and different groupings from the EPP to Renew to the Socialists and Democrats and Greens, are all potentially now looking at what they will see as targeted sanctions if this law goes through. Carrot and stick here. Do you think that this is going to make the government maybe change its mind, or is this too late?
What we say at this point, what we say at this juncture, the government does not seem to be quite amenable and palatable enough to make concessions. That's why I mentioned that benign external pressure. Of course, the pressure, which is not very much welcome in a broader sense, because still it relates to the reputation of the nation. It still relates to the image of the country. But unfortunately, sadly enough, without that intervention, without that stick and carrot added by continuing the pressure by the Georgian public from inside, I really cannot envisage and cannot accept that there is any probability of the breakthrough. So take into account that still the Georgian government pays some, albeit limited, but still some respect to that external voices. Well, we have to see. In any case, this crisis would not be hanging on for indefinite time. We'll have to see some steps, hopefully positive steps, in the coming weeks, especially taking into account that law would be sent to the president of Georgia for the presidential reaction. And then within that time period, we have to expect some hopefully breakthrough in terms of resolving this crisis.
Well, we already know what President of Georgia is going to do. She's going to veto the bill. However, later it still can be overridden by the parliament. Victor, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.